This generation has seen a lot of new IPs established that have pushed elements of video game design in terms of gameplay and story. Not every game that has tried to break the mold has been successful, and as games continue to advance, others that were once considered masterpieces might just become outdated in the future. One such game that has received the praise from many reviewers and gamers alike is the original Bioshock. Bioshock was first released in 2007 and was the spiritual successor to System Shock 2, an action role-playing survival horror game about a lone soldier who tries to stop the outbreak of a genetic infection that has devastated a starship. Considering that Bioshock is 6 years old, is the story still just as immersive as it was back in 2007? And does the gameplay still hold up, or is it showing its age? Looking at the stories told through the gameplay, Bioshock is about a young man named Jack, who ends up being the sole survivor of a plane crash, and happens to make his way to Rapture, a city under the sea, which just so happens to be on the verge of destruction. When Jack first arrives, a man named Atlas contacts him, saying that he can help Jack get out of Rapture, but Jack needs to do everything Atlas asks of him. As Jack proceeds through Rapture, he encounters the remains of the dying civilization and eradicates its crazed inhabitants. Through the guidance of Atlas, Jack eventually meets the creator of Rapture, Andrew Ryan, who reveals that Jack and him were predestined to meet, as Jack was taken from Rapture when he was a baby and conditioned into a sleeper agent by a man named Fontaine, in hopes that Jack could be used by Fontaine in order to overthrow Ryan and take control of Rapture for himself. At this point, Ryan resigns himself to death, and Atlas reveals that he is really Fontaine, and goes on to try and kill Jack. Fortunately, Jack is led to safety and is released from his conditioning. Jack proceeds to then make his way to Atlas, where they have a final confrontation where Jack is victorious. Looking at the main story, Bioshock seems like nothing new, as there have been plenty of games where you're just a pawn in someone else's larger plan. What's actually interesting about the main story is how it forces you to question your own actions, or that of the characters in video games. In most video games, you're given an objective, and through the course of the game you complete that objective. In most cases, you wouldn't question what you were doing or why you were doing it. You would just do it because you were told to. And that's kind of the point that's being made here, as while people play through games, they will blindly act out any order given to them, because of the fact that someone told them or conditioned them to do so. In much the same way Jack would blindly do anything that Atlas told him to do. Of course, for the player, there really is no other option. If you want to play and beat the game, then you have to do whatever objective you are given. There is another part to the story though, which is found through listening to the audio diaries in the game. Although the player can get a basic understanding of the story by just playing through the game, by listening to the audio logs, players get a more enhanced version, which expands on Rapture's history. It's a bit of a strange decision, considering that without listening to the audio logs, you do miss out on a lot of extra information that can clear up questions that some people might have concerning who the people are that you encounter and what their purpose is or was in Rapture. Not to mention the fact that it can be easy to miss out on some of these logs, and therefore miss out on some of the story. The only good thing about having parts of the story told through audio logs is that it's not as constraining as having the game tell the story through a series of cutscenes that you're forced to sit through, as you can listen to the audio logs while you're looking around Rapture. By listening to the audio logs, what the player learns is that Rapture was created by Andrew Ryan in order to create a society where science would thrive undisturbed by interventions from governments, religious institutions, and other social agencies. Originally, Rapture was populated by people Ryan considered to be the best examples of mankind. However, the city plans failed to accommodate the large number of labor workers who had built it, and they were forced to live in leaking and crowded housing. During this time, Dr. Tenenbaum discovered a sea slug that secreted a substance that could be used to manipulate DNA in ways that can cure diseases and give organisms amazing power. However, in order to get the funds necessary for the research, Tenenbaum turned to Frank Fontaine, who struck a deal with her, where he would fund her research for the right to profit from the findings. All of this eventually snowballed into a huge clusterfuck, as genetically enhanced citizens from the lower classes rose against the upper class citizens, resulting in a civil war between Ryan and Fontaine, who later faked his death and assumed the guise of Atlas. This then leads into the events of Bioshock. All things considered then, the story presented in Bioshock is actually pretty deep, as it brings up issues of class disparity and concerns regarding stem cells and genetic manipulation. Obviously this is a lot of information to take in, especially for people who might not really give a shit about the minute details of what caused the fall of Rapture, which is why it's understandable why this information was relegated to the audio logs instead of cutscenes. Control-wise, the game handles pretty well. At first it took me a while to get over the fact that the L1 and R1 buttons switch plasmids and weapons instead of use them, but I soon got used to it. There were also a few instances where I would stun a turret with the electro bolt, and when I went to hack it, I would instead use an Eve Hypo on myself, because both actions were regulated to the square button. But other than those minor issues, I really didn't have any other problems concerning the controls. Looking at the gameplay, Bioshock has a lot of mechanics that aren't really seen in current shooters. For starters, Bioshock doesn't restrict the amount of weapons you can hold, as players can use any weapon at any time once they find them. In more recent first-person shooters, you're usually limited to either 2 to 4 guns and are forced to pick up and drop weapons when needed. Of course, by limiting players to the amount of weapons they can hold, I find that I usually will only stick to 2 weapons for the whole game, and once I find 2 that I like, I won't drop them. This kind of defeats the purpose though, as developers want you to switch weapons in certain situations. However, I'm more concerned about picking up a new gun that isn't as good as the current one I have, or about being able to find enough ammo for this new weapon, or whether or not I'm going to be able to find the current weapon I'm using again if I decide to drop it, and end up being stuck with this new one that I hate. In this way, the 2 weapon restriction becomes even more confining, as I'm sure other people feel the same way, and therefore people aren't really getting the most they can out of the combat. But since Bioshock allows players to freely change between all 7 weapons, there's a greater chance that people will be willing to use the different weapons, or at least give them a chance. Bioshock also does a good job of balancing the weapons by giving them a limited amount of ammo, so you don't feel too overpowered when carrying around 7 weapons at once. Most guns also have 2 secondary ammos, allowing for even more variation in weapon usage, as certain ammo is more effective against certain enemies than others are. Next, Bioshock reveals the current staple of health regeneration. Instead of healing automatically, you need to use medkits or heal yourself at healing stations. By not having regenerating health, it requires players to be more cautious and maybe plan ahead when encountering enemies, as just rushing in guns blazing is not a very effective strategy, unless you plan on dying. This also makes encounters with enemies feel not as tedious because usually in shooters you'll enter a room, be greeted by 20 enemies, proceed to hide and pop out to shoot them, hide again while you recover health, and repeat until you kill everyone. But that doesn't really happen in Bioshock, as in most cases you'll maybe come across 2 to 3 enemies in a room, and on occasions, when you're about to face a large group of enemies, you'll have ample warning, where you can set up traps and hack the security systems around you to help you deal with the enemies. Besides regular weapons, Bioshock also introduced Plasmids, which are supernatural abilities that your character can use in order to take down enemies. In the beginning of the game, Plasmids are pretty effective at disabling enemies, with the only downside being that they consume a lot of Eve. However, Plasmids become less effective as you progress, needing to be upgraded in order to do any substantial damage, or even to stun the enemy for a significant amount of time. Compared to the vigors in Bioshock Infinite, I thought that the Plasmids were severely lacking, seeing as how in order to upgrade and purchase Plasmids, you need to spend a significant amount of Atom, and considering how rare Atom was to come by, the investment in Plasmids just didn't seem worth it compared to the health and Eve upgrades. There's also the fact that at most you can only hold 6 out of the potential 11 Plasmids available, so even if you unlock every Plasmid, you won't have access to them at all times. It's kind of a strange decision to limit how many Plasmids you can equip, considering that there's no restriction on how many weapons you can hold. I mean, it's not like Plasmids can be used in a limited amount of time, their usage is restricted to how much Eve you have, so I don't really think it would have been an issue if you had the ability to freely choose between all the Plasmids you unlocked. Another big part of the combat was the ability to hack security systems and turrets. Hacking security systems provided support so you didn't need to waste as much ammo, and could distract the enemies from attacking you. You could also hack shops and vending machines and healing machines to reduce their costs. In order to hack a system, there's a pipe minigame that you need to complete to unlock the system. The minigame is the same for every hackable object in the game, however the layout and tiles change depending on what you're hacking. At first, the hacking minigame is a nice distraction from the combat in the game. However, there are so many things that can be hacked that after a while it becomes incredibly tedious. There's also an issue with the hacking minigame where you could get a board where you're completely boxed in and can't make a move that won't cause you to fail. Of course, you won't know that until you start flipping over tiles. There are some workabouts to this, as you can buy out the machine, you can use a hacking tool to automatically hack the machine, or you could try again and hopefully get a different puzzle that will work. Like I said before, even though I found the hacking minigame to be a fun diversion at first, it became incredibly annoying and tedious by the middle of the game. It would have been nice if there were different minigames depending on what you decided to hack, so hacking wouldn't make me want to shoot myself in the face each time I had to hack something. And even though it's not necessary to hack every single security system in shop, the benefits of doing so outweigh those of not, so it's hard not to just suffer through the minigame to get a discount or turret to fight for you. Bioshock also introduced a perk system in the form of gene tonics. In the game, there are 58 different gene tonics that you can equip while searching Rapture, or get by researching enemies. At most, you can equip 6 at a time in 3 different categories: combat, engineering, and physiological. For the time, the perk system was pretty revolutionary, considering that most first-person shooters didn't have perks to increase your character's attributes. And although Bioshock wasn't the first to introduce a perk system, it certainly helped to enhance the combat in Bioshock, as it allowed players to pick gene tonics that would tailor Jack's attributes to their playstyle. The problem and the biggest parts about Bioshock is the Little Sisters. The Little Sisters are basically a vessel for Adam, as they were created in order to grow and harvest large quantities of Adam. During the course of the game, you'll encounter 21 Little Sisters and their bodyguards, the Big Daddies, who you'll need to defeat in order to gain access to the Little Sisters. Once you defeat the Big Daddies, you'll have a choice as to whether or not you want to harvest the sea slug from the Little Sisters, effectively killing them, or rescue them, which will purge the sea slug from their bodies, saving them. Harvesting Little Sisters rewards the player with 160 Adam, while rescuing them gives you 80. However, after rescuing 3 Little Sisters, you'll get a gift with 200 Adam and sometimes a gene tonic or plasmid. Players can use Adam to purchase more plasmids, plasmid upgrades, gene tonics, and upgrades to health and Eve. However, players will not be able to purchase every single upgrade available, so they'll need to pick and choose what upgrades they want carefully. When all is said and done, harvesting only rewards 280 more Adam than rescuing does, but harvesting rewards the player instantaneously, which will help them in the beginning of the game, whereas rescuing them offers a greater payout in the future. Whatever you choose to do will determine the ending of the game. However, the ending sequence is really only about 30 or so seconds long, and considering that this is the only change that occurs, it's really up to the player to choose what reward they want. Personally, I wish your decision had a little more effect on the gameplay as a whole, as the ending cutscene isn't really the most significant part of the game. Your journey through Rapture is, so having the journey be impacted by your choices would have been more meaningful. Besides this, the game also has some other questionable decisions. First off, I kind of felt like the last half an hour or so the game fell apart. As you make your way up to Fontaine, you're forced into an escort mission, where you need to protect Little Sister so she can help you get through the doors blocking your path to Fontaine. Along the way, the Little Sister will also stop at several spots to harvest Adam from corpses, where a few waves of enemies will ambush you and attack the Little Sister. So in general, I'm not too big of a fan of escort missions, but on top of that, during this segment your screen is obscured by this fishbowl effect, which makes it difficult to see the enemies. On top of that, the splicers seem to have no interest in going after you, and will only go after the Little Sister. The strange thing about all this though is that it doesn't really matter if the Little Sister you escort dies, as you can just walk up to a vent and get another one, which completely ruins any purpose that this section might have served. I mean, why should I give a fuck about protecting this girl if I can get another one without any consequences? The whole point of escort missions, after all, is to make sure who you're escorting makes it to the destination alive, but here it doesn't even matter. My next problem with the game involves the final encounter with Fontaine. For some reason, when you reach Fontaine's offices, he's jacked up on Adam and you have to drain it from his body, shoot him full of bullets, and do it again 3 more times. The whole thing just seems really out of place, considering that there aren't really any other bosses in the game, and for the ending to just end in a boss fight was a little disappointing. The whole thing seemed rushed to me too, like they couldn't think of a satisfying way to end the game, so instead they just put a boss fight in and slapped on a quick cutscene to close it out. Finally, early on in the game, you'll find a camera that you can use to take pictures of enemies. If you played any of the Metroid Prime games, the camera is kinda like the scanner, as taking pictures tells you what ammo the enemy is weak against. However, by taking pictures and increasing your research level, you also get damage bonuses, as well as various gene tonics, making taking pictures a worthwhile endeavor. Of course, considering that this is a shooter, in some situations you'll need to put yourself in danger in order to capture a good picture, and the later levels of research do require you to take a greater number of pictures of the enemies, so there is some tediousness to it. I'm not really too much of a fan of the camera, considering that it really breaks up the combat, seeing as how when you come across any enemy, you have to line them up in the camera, then take the photo. On top of that, a lot of the splicers look very similar to each other, so it's hard to remember or tell which enemies you have fully researched, which can result in you wasting time by taking a picture of enemies when you didn't really need to. The silver lining to this is that at least the rewards are worthwhile, and you're not just taking pictures to fill up a research book. But I think that the game would have benefited without the mechanic. So final verdict, is this game overrated? No, I don't think it is. On the surface, the story isn't necessarily new or groundbreaking, but deep down it does have some interesting themes and poses some thought-provoking questions. But to people who don't really care about Bioshock's political bullshit, I feel that Bioshock still offers a lot gameplay-wise. Rapture is a very moody and interesting place to explore, and the combat is surprisingly varied with the amount of weapons you have access to and the gene tonics that allow you to tailor your character's attributes to your playstyle. That's not to say that everything in the game is perfect, as I could do without so many hacking and researching segments, and I felt that the ending kinda fell apart. But these issues weren't enough to ruin the overall enjoyment I felt while playing through the game.